This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. President Trump has made it a priority to get gas prices down below $2 a gallon. What are the chances he'll meet his goal, and at what cost? Plus, money makes the world go round, and particularly the money wealthy people bring to their home countries, which is why the United Kingdom has to be careful about changing incentives to move abroad. And the growing world of alternative investments is on the brink of adding another asset class, investing in the $400 billion business of law firms. But we start with China and the United States and how bad things could get from two different perspectives. Macroeconomist and special contributor Larry Summers of Harvard and economic historian Niall Ferguson of the Hoover Institution. The world's biggest economies, the United States and China, have had a complicated economic and geopolitical relationship that relies on competition and cooperation at the same time.
I'm in favor of maintaining a working relationship with China. It is too important a country. It had made good progress in economic reform, and I think we should not lightly sacrifice a relationship with the country with the longest continuing history in Asia, with the cultural influence that it has.
China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, setting the stage for a tumultuous relationship between the United States and China that continues today.
With China, we have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China, and unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal. Now, I'm willing to deal with China, but they have to solve their surplus.
With the tariff program, we had a plan, we have a process, and now we have a mechanism with our Chinese counterparts to prevent an escalation again. We're going to go into a series of negotiations. They're going to be fulsome, and we have a lot to talk about, but I think over the next 90 days we can accomplish a lot.
President Trump has continued the efforts of his first administration to make the economic relationship between the two countries fair, initially imposing tariffs as high as 145% before suspending them pending negotiations. Niall Ferguson has called it a second Cold War.
It's 18 years since I used the term chimerica for the first time, and the argument back then was China and the United States are in a symbiotic relationship, but it's not symmetrical. The US does the importing, China does the exporting, the US does the consuming, and China does the saving. And the argument that I made back in 2007 was that this was not really sustainable, and that at some point chimerica would turn out to be a chimera. It actually took longer than I expected to turn sour, but certainly by 2017-18 we had the beginnings of Cold War II, when the rise of China finally elicited a response from the United States. The interesting thing, David, is that somehow chimerica and Cold War II seem capable of coexisting, because despite a trade war and a tech war, both continued by the Biden administration and ramped up by Donald Trump in his second term, the United States still imports an enormous amount from China. The relationship has been extraordinarily persistent despite the growing conflict and the escalation of Cold War II.
I'd call it hostile codependence. We're codependent with them. We depend on them. They depend on us. But our interests in the way the world is shaped going forward are very different. There can only be one leader in technology. So there are also important zero-sum competitive aspects in the relationship, and the challenge is going to be to manage it.
As much as Larry Summers agrees that the U.S. and China need each other, he does think we may be wrong about the extent of Chinese economic power.
I think the big change that, to my mind, people are underestimating is that China has immense challenges ahead of it. Yes, they have done very well in a number of key technologies, but their population is going to shrink, their debts are immense, their economic adjustment towards a more consumption-oriented economy would force the Communist Party to give up a lot of power, which I don't think they're going to do. You know, David, here's a rule. When the American elite tell their children to learn a language, it's time to bet against the country in question. That was right about Russia in 1959. That was right about Japan in 1989. And I think it's been right about China in recent years. And so I think the key priority for the United States is to maintain our strength, but also not to put so much pressure on China that we elicit a spasmodic response. Niall's the historian and he's the great expert, but many people see this through the prism of Germany and Britain before the First World War. I think it's also helpful to think about Japan and the United States before the Second World War, where a very successful set of American economic policies in holding back the Japanese economy pushed the Japanese into nationalist desperation, and that was behind Pearl Harbor. So I think in the United States we need to be very careful and not see this in terms of trying to win some great victory against China, and not forgetting that codependence is probably an inevitability.
After growing over 14% a year as recently as 2017, China's growth has slumped to an estimated 4% in 2025, according to the IMF. But the U.S. may not have the economic upper hand.
China is a much larger economy relative to the United States than any previous challenger. On a current dollar basis, it's got to within around 70% of US GDP. More strikingly, China's manufacturing value added is now twice that of the United States. And if you just go back 20 years, the roles were reversed. US manufacturing value added around at the time that China joined the World Trade Organization was roughly twice that of China's. Let's view this from China's vantage point. How do the Chinese see the American response to their rise? They see it as a rather brutal trade war that began with Donald Trump's first term and has escalated dramatically at the beginning of his second term. But that escalation turned into a game of chicken, and in that game of chicken, it was Donald Trump who swerved. It was Trump who had to step down, who had to pull back from the incredibly high tariffs that he imposed in a series of steps on China after being sworn in for a second term. So the Chinese look at the United States, and I think they often say to themselves, these guys have really passed their peak and they don't have a coherent strategy to deal with us.
I'm a bit more optimistic than Niall about the relative strength of the two economies. I think a large GDP achieved simply by having a large number of people doesn't always make you stronger. Ask yourself, if Mexico was part of the United States, we would have a higher GDP as a country, but I think we'd actually, in toto, in an aggregate, probably have a weaker economy in terms of our ability to project power. So I am a bit more optimistic about the hand the United States has to play than Niall, but a bit more disappointed by the skill with which we are playing it. I share his concern about a potentially very dangerous situation in Taiwan, though I would caution that probably to maintain deterrence, it's not that we need a capacity to win. We need a capacity to inflict enormous and problematic and risky damage while maintaining credibility to deter imprudence. And I think that's a bit more achievable than Niall suggests.
Well, there's certainly a risk. I've argued for some time that a Taiwan semiconductor crisis would be the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Cold War II. But let's remember that there's something very distinctive about the US-China relationship that makes it quite different from the 20th century conflicts and challenges that Larry talked about. China really had caught up or was very close to catching up in key domains, including artificial intelligence and quantum computing. China has shown that technological containment of the sort that Jake Sullivan recommended when he was National Security Advisor hasn't really worked.
I am far more worried about dependence on China for debt than I am dependence on China for rare earths or any other specific product.
Whether it's competition in technology or dependence on foreign investment in U.S. debt, both Larry and Niall agree that the tax and spending bill currently working its way through Congress will do little to improve the United States' position when it comes to China.
It's not a big, beautiful bill. It's a prescription for deadly dangerous decline. It's ill-advised, it's imprudent, it fails to recognize at all a basic truth that the world's greatest debtor is unlikely to stay the world's greatest power. We are making a very serious mistake by continuing on the fiscal path that we are on. And it's not even clear that if we're given more rope, if the debts are allowed to grow, that may just be ultimately increasing our vulnerability. Niall and I are in complete agreement on that.
Well, these relationships are complex, but you could simplify the story a bit by just saying as long as the United States consistently runs a large budget deficit, it's probably going to run a rather large current account deficit, and attacking bilateral trade imbalances is unlikely to overcome that fundamental problem. There's nothing in President Trump's big, beautiful bill that's currently going through Congress that seems likely to reduce the US federal deficit from around 6 or thereabouts % of GDP. And so the debt continues to accumulate. Ferguson's law, which I introduced back in January to try to focus the administration's mind, states that when a great power is spending more on interest payments than on defense, it probably won't be great for that much longer. And that is a law that has applied to every empire since Spain's in the 17th century. And so I think if you look at the fiscal position of the United States, that's the fundamental structural problem. And as long as presidents, including President Trump, won't touch the underlying problems of Social Security and Medicare, an aging population with a welfare system designed for a previous demographic structure, the imbalance is bound to persist. It's worth adding, though, that China also has its fiscal problem.
Niall and I are also in agreement that what's called the taco trade in markets, Trump always chickens out, which is why people see market declines because of one of these tariff announcements as a buying moment. That taco trade in markets is a geopolitical disaster because it tempts adventurism, just as John Kennedy's ignominious retreat at the Bay of Pigs contributed to the problems that the United States faced later, very dangerous moments at Berlin, at the Cuban Missile Crisis, show these blustering threats followed by retreat on tariffs make us not credible and with big ambition. Speaking loudly and carrying a small stick is a prescription for compromising your national security.
Coming up, can President Trump achieve his goal of $2 a gallon gas? And for how long? And what would it mean for the U.S. economy? That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about setting goals that are realistic, but also that are the right ones. Our colleagues Alex Steele and Michael McKee take a look at the president's goal of getting gasoline below $2 a gallon.
A cornerstone of President Trump's economic agenda is lower gasoline prices.
Energy is going down. I see that we had a couple of states where gasoline was at $1.98 a gallon.
$1.99 might be a stretch now. If President Trump gets his wish of $40 oil, it could be a reality.
The number one thing that sets the price of gasoline is the price of crude oil. And as we've seen gasoline prices drop over the past year or so, the thing that's driven that above all is the price of crude oil coming down. So simple as that, really.
Ed Crooks is vice chair of the Americas at Wood Mackenzie, a leading data and analytics firm. Crooks says it's possible we get another oil price crash like the one we had in 2016, which dragged oil down to $26 a barrel and pump prices to $1.70.
It's certainly possible that we can get back to a point like the situation we were in 2015, 2016, where we had very low oil prices down below $40 a barrel, and that led to very cheap gasoline. So we might have a period, maybe a year or two, with very low oil prices, very low gasoline prices.
Why does it always feel like prices at the pump go up faster than they go down?
There is some evidence on that. If you think about it, though, take a step back, you think about the big picture, then people will say, well, because of these movements, because of gasoline prices going up faster than they come down, therefore refiners must be making fantastic profits.
The reality is, the price of oil only accounts for half of the price of a gallon of gasoline. About 30% is then equally split between federal and state taxes and distribution and marketing, moving the gasoline around the country and selling it at the gas station. The rest are those refining costs and profits.
Refining is not a hugely lucrative business. In fact, particularly right now, profit margins in refining have been squeezed right down. It's really hard to make a good return in the refining business.
No one knows that better than Andy Walsh, president of Downstream, Midstream, and Chemicals at Chevron.
We're trying to buy low and sell high. So it's just like if you were to run a restaurant, the raw materials you buy and the meals you sell to people, that's the restaurant's crack spread. Same exact concept in refining.
It's Andy's job to make sure the 1.8 million barrels of oil products a day that Chevron produces flow safely, efficiently, and profitably. More than half of that comes from the U.S.
I mean, this is huge. Give me some perspective on how big this all is.
Yeah, so the whole property is about 3,000 acres. Most of the processing stuff is on about 1,000 acres, so it's a really big facility, a lot of complex things going on here.
Chevron's refinery in Pascagoula, Mississippi runs 24/7, takes 35 different types of crude and turns it mostly into gasoline, diesel, fuel for jets, ships, railroads, and farm equipment, and even propane, what you may use for your barbecue.
We're either breaking down molecules, putting molecules back together, we're taking some product out of it, maybe it's sulfur, maybe it's a metal, we're squeezing it, we're making it very hot, but we're doing a lot of chemical things to take a raw material and turn it into a thing like gasoline.
The oil is separated, pressurized, and heated more than a dozen times to keep changing the molecules. It's complicated work with razor-thin margins.
And I wish I had more control over margins. I really don't. It's based on supply and demand, and if margins are good, we really want to run. If margins are bad, we still need to run.
And so I think when people kind of take that jump to say, this is outrageous, the oil companies are ripping us off, and they're making so much money out of refining, that's not really accurate at all.
If refiner greed isn't a hurdle to sub-$2 gasoline, supply might be. Over the past decade, 10 refiners have closed, either because of damage or because they transitioned to process renewable fuels.
Refineries have been closing down. As you know, in the US alone, Lyondell shut down earlier this year. So this is another problem that, yes, while crude oil prices are going to be low, it's not necessarily the same case for what you and I consume, which is gasoline and diesel.
Amrita Sen is the founder and director of market intelligence at Energy Aspects, a global data and intelligence firm. Sen is one of the most prolific voices in the industry.
The one thing I'm very, very confident about is on that refined products markets, because the volume of refineries we are continuing to shut down and just modest demand growth for gasoline, diesel, and jet will lead us to some significantly higher pump prices.
COVID also did permanent damage to the industry.
Yeah, COVID was a challenging time for our industry. That was hard. running the plant at minimum was hard. In fact, it ended up making several refineries in the United States close. It was either impossible, uneconomic, or super difficult. And we lost a lot of refineries in the U.S. And they're probably never going to come back. Once you close a refinery, I think it's kind of the end of the line. And it's sad, but that's what happened.
So what does that do for a supply-demand dynamic when it comes to, say, gasoline?
It makes it tighter. Yeah, if somebody that used to make gasoline is no longer making it, others have to pick up the slack and have to do it.
The U.S. hasn't seen a new large refiner since 1977. Smaller ones have been built and existing plants have expanded. U.S. capacity is now at 18.4 million barrels a day. The real problem is coming. California will see almost 1/5 of its crude processing capacity vanish in the next 12 months after Valero and Phillips 66 idle a combined 284,000 barrels of daily refining capacity.
The problem is from 2027 onwards, if you look at our refining kind of global landscape, it only gets worse. We've got more closures coming because refining is such a slow-moving industry, right? 7 years it kind of takes to build one, and there are no new builds in the West anyways. So I think we are in for a period of very high refined products prices, even if crude doesn't go up, by the way, regardless of what you think crude's going to do. And you could disagree with me and say, oh, no, demand's not going to be great, and, you know, shale will bounce back, whatever. We can disagree on that.
$2 gasoline is definitely not a good sign for the oil industry. The U.S. is now the largest producer in the world, a different dynamic than previous oil sell-offs.
The crude price that you'd need to get gasoline down to $1.99 is one that would be absolutely miserable for people in the US oil industry, for oil producers. It's certainly a level that would lead to job cuts. It's a level that would lead to rigs being laid down, people drilling less, and so on.
Most Americans agree they would like lower gasoline prices, but that might not actually be good for the country.
I think, though, you've got to think about gasoline as being a bit like a health check, the barometer, temperature check. If you do see gasoline prices really kind of starting to plumb the depths and go significantly below where they are today, that's probably a sign that all is not well in the world economy.
We need to think about what's this cycle going to look like, because, again, it was not some fundamental shift in the market for oil that caused this particular cycle to be intensified. It was some tariff policies that may or may not be permanent. We don't know how that's all going to shake out. The most typical economic reaction to uncertainty is to do nothing. Don't buy that car, don't buy that house, don't bring out that new product, don't make that investment. All of those things, we tend to just lay back and do nothing. If the uncertainty ebbs to some extent, I think you'll see global demand coming back pretty quickly. This may be a fairly short cycle if that happens.
Ray Perryman is an economist who's been studying the economic effects of oil prices for 40 years.
Our most recent study indicated that today, if you take the oil that's produced in the Permian and then you look at the downstream, the upstream, and everything else that happens with the oil produced in this region, it's responsible for about 1 million jobs in the United States.
Texas is an intersection of the economic fallout from low oil prices and producers taking their foot off the gas. Kirk Edwards is an oil and gas producer who is seeing the ripple effects in the Permian Basin firsthand.
It's the rest of the country that benefits from the gasoline price. Again, people in Midland, Odessa, we would rather see higher gasoline prices because it means the oil price is good and the economy is going to be good. But it is a side effect for everybody because everybody has to use gasoline in their cars right now to go to work and fly and do things like that.
And that's where we turn next week on Wall Street Week, when we go to Midland, Odessa, the heart of the Permian Basin.
Up next is Milan starting to look a bit more British. A story of how the wealthy are responding to changes in British tax law. This is a story about the rich and famous, or at least about the rich and their migratory habits. Global elites are constantly on the move, but where they choose to call home or desert is often dictated less by lifestyle than by what they pay in taxes. As our London colleague Lizzie Burden reports, in this global shuffle of fortunes, one Italian city is coming out on top.
Nestled away on a leafy street in one of Milan's most stylish neighbourhoods lies the former home of famed fashion executive Santo Versace. Take a step inside and you'll enter the Wild, the private club catering to Milan's rapidly growing wealthy class.
The wonderful thing about Milan, it's an hour and a half by plane from London. You can drive to the south of France in 2.5 hours. You can drive to the beach in a couple of hours. You can be in St. Moritz in an hour and a half.
Gary Landsberg's been heavily involved in private clubs in London.
So my first foray into private clubs was with a great club, the Arts Club, which was founded in 1863 by Charles Dickens. And I was fortunate enough to be able to, with my partners, acquire the business. It's got an amazing history, and clubs go back to the late 1800s in London. You have Brooks, White's, all these amazing clubs. Boodles.
But Gary opened the Wild last year, a club emblematic of a global wealth movement into places like Milan, Monaco and the Middle East, away from London.
Private clubs, if you go back to the 1800s, I think there was something like 300 clubs at the time. There was a lot. And, you know, over the years they've evolved. In 2025 in London, people still like going to private clubs, but unfortunately a lot of the clientele have actually left.
And that's due in part to the UK government abolishing the so-called non-dom regime.
We will raise specific taxes. We want to end the non-dom status completely. I think that the super rich should be paying their tax.
It is a term relatively unique to the UK, and it's short for non-domiciled. So it refers to people who have, or until very recently, have had special tax treatment because they were considered non-domiciled in the UK, meaning that their permanent home is in a different country.
Nina Skerrow is the CEO at the Centre for Economics and Business Research in London. Previously, a non-dom would avoid UK tax on foreign income and pay a small fee after a few years. Now they won't pay tax for the first 4 years, but then they'll be taxed like everybody else on their worldwide income.
In short, it's the beginning of the end of the non-dom regime. So it is a big tightening of the rules. The previous big change was in 2017 under the Conservative government, where they essentially capped the period at 15 years. They said if you've been here for 15 of the past 20 years, you can't really genuinely say that you're not a non-dom. But this is now making the rules all the tighter.
Manchester United owner Jim Ratcliffe famously relocated from Britain to Monaco in 2020 in a move that was expected to save him £4 billion in tax payments.
I wasn't a fan of the non-dom change. I thought that was very foolish. I mean, you've got 60,000 very wealthy people in London. Why do you want to encourage them to leave? It doesn't make any sense to me, really. Because they all bring, enormous value to that economy.
And now he's being joined by fellow football club owners, banking executives and real estate magnates in departing Britain. Last year, the UK had a net loss of almost 11,000 millionaires, a 157% jump from a year before, which was already the highest number in a decade.
I think the numbers that will come out in 2025 will be shocking.
Really?
I think will be shocking. The trickle-down effect on the economy is huge. Everyone who leaves will have people that work for them, whether it's in their business, in their office, in their home.
And how is it directly impacting your business, your investment strategy?
Well, I think, for someone that was pretty much heavily invested in London, I'm completely divested from London. I have nothing here. I have a few real estate investments, but I'm certainly not looking at this stage to invest back into London in the short term.
But the government is confident it's made the right decision.
Are you concerned that your non-dom tax changes will cost more than they raise?
No, I'm not concerned. We made a manifesto commitment to ensure that non-doms do pay their fair share of tax in the UK, but combined with a temporary repatriation facility, which makes it easier for people to bring money into the UK without facing punitive tax. This is a highly mobile group of people, but as well as people leaving the UK for a whole variety of reasons, we have every year thousands of people, including some of the wealthiest people, come to the UK because they can see that this is a great place to do business, a great place to grow a business.
The government's Independent Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that 12% of non-doms will leave the UK, but that the new regime will offset that by raising almost £34 billion over the next 5 years. Nina Skerrow isn't so sure.
I think there's very, very good reason to think that the government departments are underestimating the extent to which people are going to either leave the UK or people that would have come to the UK otherwise aren't going to come. And what we have found is that tipping point, where is the government making money, is the government losing money net, is around 1 in 4. So if more than a quarter of non-DOMs, people currently claiming the status, are no longer in the UK, that is the point at which the government actually starts losing money. And looking at the OBR's own estimates and some other external estimates for how many people might consider leaving the UK as a result, 25% is very, very much within the realm of possibilities. So if you're asking yourself, do I want to go to the UK? Do I want to stay in the UK? Is this a good place to start a business, to grow a business? There is more and more ticks in the no column.
Are you saying that it could affect London's status as a global financial hub?
Yeah, and I think absolutely changes to non-DOMs is putting a bit of a damper on the status of London globally. And that's kind of a continuation, a little bit of a trend.
So, if not London, why Milan? That's where Marco Cerato comes in.
I'm an Italian tax lawyer, so specialized on tax, and in that field it means both taxation of corporation, taxation of individuals. I would say that my personal practice increased towards taxation of individuals in the past years because of the new rules.
The new rules to which he refers are Italy's flat tax regime. Individuals pay a flat €200,000 a year on foreign income for up to 15 years, a figure that was doubled last year.
You've got all of the fiscal pressures, not just in Italy, but across Europe and around the world. How likely is it that this flat tax can endure? Because, of course, it's already gone up from 100,000 to 200,000. Can it last?
The decision of the government back in August 2024 to double the tax from 100,000 to 200,000 has been indeed considered by foreign observers from my field as a confirmation of the willingness of the government to keep the regime rather than an indicator that the regime might be unstable. Consider that this regime is there since 2017 and has never been changed, apart from this increase, which has an inflation component, because don't forget it was introduced 8 years ago, so there was an inflationary period. And also there was the willingness of the government to contain discussions or debates about the fairness of this regime, because by increasing and doubling the tax, they have willingly restricted the amount of net worth individuals moving to Milan, thereby reducing the discussion about the fairness.
Cerato spent most of his life in Milan and has watched the city evolve.
Well, Milan changed a lot in the last 50 years. At the beginning, it was an industrial city. During the years, it became a service city. It attracted a lot of people. So 50 years ago, most of the people, at least the people who were wealthy, were Milanese. Now it's very difficult to find somebody who is purely Milanese.
Yet an influx poses its own problems. Real estate in Milan has comfortably outpaced wage growth over the past decade, with prices rising 49%, while other major Italian cities have stayed largely flat or even decreased.
It's quite a small city, it's quite condensed, so they don't have a lot of huge developments going on. There's been a big influx of expats. They all pretty much want to live in the same area, which makes it quite difficult, first for them to find actually spaces, and second of all, because there's not a lot of supply and there's a huge amount of demand. What's happening in the local community actually is getting outpriced because they haven't seen prices like this before. The good quality Milan real estate is certainly seeing a huge increase in values.
Would you say that Italy is more aware that it's in a global competition to attract high net worth individuals than, for example, the UK government?
I'm not so sure the government is so keen in entering into a global competition to attract these people. They just realize that it's good to have people from abroad with high spending capacity, making investment. This regime was introduced by a left-wing government. This counter-government is a right-wing. Meanwhile, there were, I think, 7 governments of different colors, all the different parties looked at this regime and decided to keep it. So paradoxically, the political instability of Italy has been the best test to consider this as a stable tax regime.
Italy's government might not consider itself in a competition to attract the wealthy, but it is doing just that. And Landsberg says the UK faces an uphill battle to lure them back.
You'll get the results of 25 in 26. They'll start talking about it. They'll start probably tweaking with it by 27. And then everyone will be worried about an election in, I think, 29. And if you've kind of been around long enough, you kind of see the patterns. And you know, I think, you know, they're not going to turn the ship round today.
And in the meantime, they can always look east to Italy.
I keep repeating my clients that Italy is a very bad place to work if you are an Italian professional or employee, because you pay a lot of taxes on your income, but it's a very nice place to die because there is a net of the flat tax regime. There is a very favorable regime on inheritance and gifts.
Coming next, and you thought lawyers were only a drag on the bottom line. And now they may be the next big alternative for your investments. Next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about turning a cost center into an investment opportunity. For generations, lawyers have been a necessary cost to be managed and minimized. But now that may be changing.
The legal industry as a whole has become a big business, and we've got firms, I think there are 58 firms that have more than $1 billion in revenue.
Lisa Smith is head of the Washington, D.C. office of Fairfax Associates, which advises law firms on business strategy.
The investment opportunity is high. I think the question is how to add value, how outside investors could add value.
In the past, when you were looking for exciting new investment opportunities, American law firms weren't on the top of the list. There's no question that the overall market is big, with revenues estimated to total just over $343 billion in 2022, up almost $100 billion from 10 years before, according to the St. Louis Fed. But until recently, all that money was more or less kept within the protected guild of those who'd gone to law school and been called to the bar. We lawyers worked for Wall Street, but we were something separate and distinct from Wall Street. Just ask Professor David Wilkins of Harvard Law School.
So you and I went to law school because we didn't want to do business. It's not just that we were not going to business school, it was a sort of an oppositional idea, as I think your Justice Powell once said, but at least distant from business.
As much as we tend to think of the legal profession as tied to traditions going back hundreds of years in Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, it has made some fundamental changes through the years, starting with who was let into the tribe.
So we're in this wonderful Casperson room, which is filled largely with the portraits of old white men. But this is a big exception. Tell us about this.
It is. This is the first class of women who came to Harvard Law School, which is both a thing to celebrate and also a little to be embarrassed about, because these women did not come until 1950. Wow. In other words, Harvard Law School had no women prior to 1950. And this is a portrait of that remarkable group of women, many of whom went on to do quite remarkable things. It's important for us to remember, in other words, that it wasn't so long ago that the definition of merit did not include 50% of the population.
Social pressures led to changes in the 60s and 70s, but now it's a new kind of pressure, the financial kind, that is pointing to fundamental changes in the way lawyers do their work, brought on by an enormous growth in the size and complexity of the matters lawyers are taking on.
The cost of litigation, the time litigation takes, the amount of investment either a law firm or the plaintiff has to make to even be able to figure out, is it a good enough case? How can I win this case? It just is cost prohibitive for the average person, and frankly, for the average firm, because a law firm that takes a contingency case, that's not their only contingency case.
Boris Zeisser is a partner at Schulte Roth. where he is co-head of its finance and derivatives practice.
I think it's the need for capital, given how expensive it is to litigate, that has created this need for this outside investment.
As the cases have gotten bigger and more expensive, so have the law firms that handle them.
Top law firm partners are being recruited from one law firm to another, and they're being paid something like $20 million a year, guaranteed for 5 years. I used to joke that law firm partners are paid like middle relievers. They're now being paid like starting pitchers. You start to have that in global enterprises, in dozens of locations with tens of thousands of people, if you count all the people who are not lawyers who work in these organizations. And pretty soon you realize that if you're running one of these things, you need not only the skills of an excellent lawyer, you need to also understand how to manage a complex business.
The transformation in the practice of law has already brought with it outside investment, largely in the form of litigation finance, where investors take an interest in individual cases or groups of cases.
Litigation funding is just the securitization of litigation assets. And again, it started out as a kind of cottage industry, mostly focused, frankly, on plaintiffs' firms who are looking for ways to defray the big investment. Increasingly, what we're going to see is, by the way, companies bringing them in to bundle cases together. So just like subprime mortgages, for better and for worse, we are now seeing, litigation as an aggregate asset in which people are bundling cases together, because from the company's point of view, it's an aggregate risk.
But now there's the possibility of private financing, not just for individual cases or groups of cases, but for the law firms themselves.
Law firms borrow money all the time, and there are restrictions in every state on how a law firm can take on capital, if you want to call it generically. The more recent development was that a few years ago, Arizona and Utah as well have created a new structure, alternative business structure, ABS. It's actually not new. It's new in the United States. It has actually existed in the UK for over a decade, but it's new here. And what that allows a law firm to do, it's still a law firm. It's important to understand an ABS is still a law firm, but it's a law firm that has obtained a license, has gone through a rigorous licensing process with a committee that operates under the auspices of the Supreme Court of that state.
The best example of this is in the UK, which shortly after the global financial crisis began to deregulate what its legal structures and markets could look like. One of the things that they did was take off the restriction that the only capital that could be in a legal organization had to come from lawyers. In other words, you couldn't have external capital. They also took off the restriction that only lawyers could be partners in legal organizations. Now you can have multidisciplinary partnerships. That's meant, for example, the big four accountancy firms are now licensed to practice law in the UK.
The prospect of attracting outside investment in law firms may be attractive for the partners in the firms, but it's not without its complications. Nearly all states in the U.S. forbid lawyers from sharing ownership with non-lawyers, or even sharing fees, except under certain limited circumstances.
It's not just any business. In other words, it's not the same as running a manufacturing company or even running an investment bank or a hedge fund. Because the people who are at the core of this business, who are lawyers, also have a set of professional obligations that are not just maximizing shareholder profit or short-term return. They have larger duties and responsibilities to protect and preserve the rule of law, which is core to American business, to American society, to our freedoms as a nation to democracy.
For the profession, the question comes down to whether it can pursue both the raising of outside capital and adhere to the professional obligations each lawyer pledges to uphold when we are sworn into the bar. Boris Zeisser thinks that it can.
There is a real difference between the practice of law, I think, and the business of law. And quite frankly, having somebody who's not a lawyer, who has the financial acumen to help a law firm be more efficient, more profitable, function more smoothly, take advantage of the technological, whether it's AI or any other technological advancement, I think only inures to the benefit of the clients. And the lawyers are still subject to the same disciplinary rules, ethics rules. Nothing changes based on that.
Despite some concerns about what it could do to the profession, it looks like private investment of various forms is coming to law. But is it a good investment? As with most investments, the answer is a resounding maybe.
I would say, could it be a good investment? Well, it could be. Not every investment ends up being a good investment, but that's also in some ways similar to investing in any other service business.
Professor Wilkins recently put the question whether law firms could be good investments to some lawyers who also are venture capitalists.
We did a wonderful 2 hours on exactly this, in which both of the venture capitalists said, I'd be very hesitant to invest in a law firm for exactly the reasons that you said.
And those reasons that make investing in law tricky include the fact that the major drivers of revenue, partners and their clients, can simply walk out the door.
Lawyers are free to leave, but can it be efficient enough and profitable enough to retain the talent that it needs in order to thrive? And will the investment actually help it do those things?
I think that's the biggest risk factor, and that raises the question of what value outside of the people side could an investor bring? Is it technology know-how? Is it building a brand where the brand is bigger than the individual partners? And so I think there's the question that private equity in particular needs to be able to answer, which is what's the know-how that they're bringing that firms can't do themselves.
Whatever the risks or hurdles, it looks like private investments in the business of law are inevitable. It may not be in the room yet, but it's certainly knocking on the door of the legal establishment.
I mean, I get calls probably once a month from a private equity firm looking to understand the legal industry. So there's no question that they are interested in this and they're trying to figure out how to make it work. I think unless it can be 2 + 2 = 5, there's really no reason to do it. And I think that's where you also see the rub.
Up next, Harvard in the crosshairs from current Professor Larry Summers and former Professor Niall Ferguson. The Trump administration has made no secret that it is displeased with Harvard, from the way it's handled anti-Semitism, to its hiring, to its admissions procedure. Now the government is canceling funding for research, and it's banning foreign students from attending next fall, all of which has gone quickly to the courts. Our special contributor Larry Summers has spent much of his career at Harvard as a student, as a professor, and as president. Niall Ferguson was a colleague of Larry's at Harvard for a time and is now senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. What is your reaction to what you've seen? I know you've been outspoken in the past about a relative lack of viewpoint diversity on America's college campuses.
Well, David, I'm not a fan of the way the Trump administration is going after Harvard, and indeed, by implication, going after the entire higher education sector, because I think it's taken a bazooka to what should have been a surgical operation. Let me try to make clear what I mean. Harvard, and I taught there for 12 years, indeed was hired by one Larry Summers many moons ago, was a great university when I started teaching there. By the time I moved from Harvard to the Hoover Institution in 2016, there were signs of really serious rot. at the heart of Harvard University, and they were numerous. It was clear that admissions had become, at best, inequitable and at worst, corrupt. There were all kinds of curious phenomena in hiring and promotion. The atmosphere on campus had become censorious to the point that people were self-censoring in the classroom, and it was really quite painful to watch. In the years after I left, things only got worse. The moment in the wake of October 7th, 2023, when student groups appeared to come out in support of Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel, just was a moment of revelation of how badly the culture of the university had deteriorated. I think if the Trump administration had said, Harvard seems to be in violation of its civil rights obligations, as much as once upon a time Bob Jones University was in violation of them. Only today the discrimination is based on wokeism, on diversity, equity, and inclusion rather than segregationism. I think there would have been a pretty strong case to be made. But instead, the administration decided to fire bazookas and, in effect, seek to take over the running of what is a private institution. So the frustrating thing to me, as somebody who's campaigned against this kind of problem in higher education, is that the Trump administration seems to me to be blowing the opportunity to apply legitimate pressure. And as a result, it's probably strengthening the very forces inside academia that needed to be weakened.
Larry, do you agree with Niall that it was appropriate and is appropriate for the government to have some role in prompting the reform?
Look, I think the right motto for Harvard is resist and reform. What the Trump administration has done is extra legal. You're not allowed to just go cutting off money, cutting off punishing with no hearings, no due process. It's overbroad in the extreme. Let's assume there's anti-Semitism in the history department. Is that really a reason to deny foreign students scholarships to do cutting-edge cancer research? They are inevitably going to be prompting a backlash against Israeli and Jewish students, as people say, because of arguing about the treatment of Israeli and Jewish students, the university's being damaged in all these ways by cutting off of funding. And that's going to breed anti-Semitism. So I think this is going to be counterproductive in the extreme. It is entirely correct that universities have academic freedom, but academic freedom is very different from impunity. Academic freedom does not include freedom from criticism. It does not include the right to not follow the law in the United States. There's a difficult set of questions, David, Niall, about what, if any, distinction do you want to make between, and here I would not accept Niall's analogy, between a Bob Jones University or University of Alabama in the 1960s type situation where there is blatant discrimination against a long-term minority that was previously the victim of segregation. That's in a class by itself. I, for one, think that it's an egregious error to somehow conflate extra efforts to recruit minorities with being the equivalent of George Wallace at the door of the University of Alabama. And I think we'll find our way forward on these issues better if, on the one hand, progressives recognize that the pendulum has swung too far, and on the other hand, those who are more conservative and cautious recognize that there's a big difference between George Wallace at the door and what was happening in much of this country through much of its history.
Niall, I'm going to give you last word here.
Well, 2 points briefly, David. First, discrimination's discrimination. And it doesn't seem to me, as far as civil rights law is concerned, that it matters what the motive is. There was discrimination going on at Harvard. It was quite explicit. White male candidates were essentially not viable for a whole series of posts. And it doesn't really matter in the eyes of the law what the motive for that discrimination is. It's wrong and it shouldn't have been happening. The second point I'll make is that universities are quite long-lived institutions. Harvard's a lot older than the United States of America, having been founded in the 1630s, when it was in fact a British university. And British universities have had their run-ins with powerful rulers. My old college at Oxford, Magdalen, was taken on by James II, who tried to impose a Catholic president on the fellows. Well, not long after that attempt, he found himself on the run, having been deposed by William of Orange. And Magdalen College, I was there just the other night, is still going strong. Harvard will still be going strong long after President Trump has left the White House. It's got the resources to withstand this onslaught. I agree with something Larry said, that if all of this makes reform less likely, then ultimately Harvard will not deserve to regain the title of best university in America, or indeed the world. You can't be the best university in the world if you engage in discrimination at admissions and in hiring, if you're not committed, truly committed to the pursuit of truth, not the pursuit of social justice, and if you're not fundamentally committed to the priority of excellence over all other criteria. Harvard's a long way from there. And in that sense, my hope is that new universities, like the University of Austin, will mount a challenge to Harvard's preeminence, just as Harvard once mounted a challenge to Oxford's preeminence many years ago.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.